Consider this. You're a king or a queen in silk and gold adornments, master of thousands. You occupy the throne. You are the law. But your people turn against you. The same people who genuflected at your feet now sharpen the axe to end your life. Monarch rule equaled wealth, honor, and divinity. But foes, treachery, and death, usually a painful one, for the majority. Let's take a brief look back at some of the most bloody beheadings of the medieval royal variety. Some died in battle, and some on the gallows, but all ultimately lost their heads for being at the head. Stay with me, friends, because it's going to get dark. Mary, Queen of Scots, the Butchered Queen, 1587. Start with one of history's most notorious executions. Mary, Queen of Scots, brash, intelligent, and openly threatening England's Queen Elizabeth II, was in prison for 19 years before she was put on trial for death. The offense: plotting to assassinate Elizabeth. The reality: a war of wits between two queens, where one would have an axe to her throat. It was on February 8th, 1587, that Mary was led to the scaffold at Fotheringham Castle. She wore a crimson-red petticoat, the hue of Catholic martyrdom. She knelt, and the executioner lifted his axe. One blow, and it's all over, isn't it? Wrong. The first strike was wild and landed on the back of her head. She groaned. The second strike nearly beheaded her, but left some tendons behind. The executioner had to hack at what remained of the flesh with his axe. And when he finally held up her severed head for all to see, her wig fell off, exposing her graying hair, a world away from the young queen she once was. Picture the terror of the onlooking crowd. This was not merely an execution, but a savage, degrading spectacle. Edward II, the king who died in agony, 1327. The fall of Edward II is a medieval tragedy. He was a king of England infamous for his catastrophic campaigns, his preference for some of his male friends, to the ire of his nobles, and his unhappy marriage to Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France. Isabella and Roger Mortimer invaded England, deposed Edward, and imprisoned him at Berkeley Castle. And then comes the most notorious, the most horrific royal death in history. They inform him that he was secretly assassinated, but other people, especially historians during his time, a whispered account of an even uglier fate. Edward, according to rumor, was pinned beneath and murdered in the most abhorrent possible manner, with a red-hot poker thrust up his anus. Why? So that they would not be scared. Whether it was or wasn't, Edward's murder did serve to reinforce the fact that no one, even kings, was immune from actual medieval brutality. Louis XVI, the king who was executed by the guillotine, 1793. On to the French Revolution, because no compilation of royal assassinations would be complete without mention of the decapitation of King Louis XVI. Unlike medieval monarchs who sat upon thrones through God's benevolence, Louis XVI was a king suspended between two revolutions. The French had suffered from famine, economic devastation, and sheer injustice. The monarchy could afford to bide its time when revolutionaries overran the Bastille in 1789. By 1793, great King Louis was headed for the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. There were thousands there, some laughing, some crying. As he ascended the scaffold, he tried to say, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death." The people laughed, though. The drums rolled. The blade fell. The French monarchy was lost in a moment, 1,000 years of it. Less well recalled, alas, is the horrific aftermath of the head being severed. The executioner brandished Louis's severed head in the air, and people cheered. People surged forward to dab handkerchiefs in his blood, which they thought was revolutionary in its qualities. A king's death was no longer something to be mourned. It was something to be cheered. Here is the reality. Power never protected medieval queens and kings from a gruesome death. We should prefer to imagine kings and queens as sacred, perched on their throne and reigning supreme, their whim law. Truth is no fairy tale but a raw, inexorable fact. No crown, no army, and no divine right could all entirely protect them from the whim of destiny. Much more often than not, their deadliest foes were not hostile legions or disgruntled farmers. No, betraying them were men who marched in step with them, dined in the same company as them, and swore themselves to them in service. Their kin, their loveliest masters, and their bestest friends were often the very hands that slew them. Think, for example, of Richard III, the final Plantagenet King of England. He did not perish in some palace of luxury, but on the mud of Bosworth Field in 1485, his body battered by the blows of his attackers, his skull crushed by a killing blow. His remains, lost for centuries, were found many years later, buried under a car park, a not very regal resting place for a once great king. Or Charles I of England, so sure of the divine right of kings that he would not negotiate with his own parliament. The result? A civil war, a trial, and a public execution in 1649. The same subjects over whom he had ruled sat quietly in witness as the executioner's axe descended and parted his head from his shoulders. A king brought down to the level of man in the eyes of his people. Marie Antoinette, once attired in the finest silks and diamonds, a symbol of decadence in revolutionary France. Her reign did not end in decadence, but on the cold blade of the guillotine. The crowd jeered as her head fell off, as they had her husband, King Louis XVI, when he met the same end. The invincible monarchy was in shambles in a whirlwind of revolution and blood. To be a king was not to defend, it was to shoot at targets. And what does it say? The kings had ruled with absolute authority for centuries and had thought God himself had anointed them. But history is something else again, a realm in which power comes and goes, and even the greatest of the leaders can be brought low in an instant. The killing of a king is not about blood and violence, it's about fear, fear of losing power, fear of betrayal, fear of being reminded that however high you may have climbed, the fall is always there at the next moment. Perhaps most of all, it is a chilling reminder. Power never seems to be quite as much an object as it seems to be. So what's your opinion? Were these monarch assassinations justifiable? Were they necessary to eradicate tyrannical rule? Or were they simply acts of vengeance masquerading as justice? Let's talk about it in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip into history's most horrific royal death, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. History is full of dark, fascinating stories, and I couldn't be more excited to discover more with you. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.